My guest today is Sohaib Sultan. Sohaib is currently the Muslim chaplain at Princeton University. He's also the author of Qur'an for Dummies, as well as an annotated commentary and selection of verses of the Qur'an and sayings of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. I was fortunate enough to meet Sohaib my second year at Princeton when I was a graduate student doing my PhD. That's when he started his chaplaincy there. Sohaib has been a tremendous force at Princeton University in bringing the Muslim community together, not just at the university, but also in the surrounding area. He's also transformed the concept of Muslim chaplaincy in American universities. He's left a tremendous mark. This is a wonderful person. You definitely want to hear the entirety of this conversation. I do want to warn you that towards the end of the conversation, we get a little bit personal and we talk about some of Sohaib's health challenges. I don't want to spoil it for you, but I do want to say, if you're watching this and you watch the whole thing, please pause and say a prayer for our good friend Sohaib Sultan. Inshallah, Allah give him great health, inshallah, and long life. Without further ado, please enjoy this conversation with none other than Sohaib Sultan. Sohaib, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's so nice to be here. Greetings of peace and blessings to everyone.
Wa alaikum assalam. It's so good to hear you and see you. So I thought the best place to begin is how we first met, which was at Princeton.
Yeah.
If I remember correctly, I had already finished my first year of graduate school, or I was about wrapping up. And then all of a sudden I hear, there's a Muslim chaplain. So I'm like, okay, let me go visit this Muslim chaplain. And that's sort of where our relationship began. So
That's right.
I thought that maybe what we could begin with is helping people understand what exactly is a chaplain, what is the chaplaincy, and what is it that you do all day?
Yeah, that's right. It's a good place to begin. And I remember being very excited to meet you and other, talented graduate students at Princeton. And it gave me confidence that I wouldn't be all by myself fishing in this large ocean of chaplaincy, and I would have resources to draw upon. Because I think that's what the heart of chaplaincy is about. The heart of chaplaincy is about, trying to get the community to work together and to try to bring the resources and the talents and the energy of the community together to build, a vibrant and positive and happy community. And so my particular role as a chaplain is a few-fold. One is to organize what we would call, ministry, and what we mean by ministry is the religious, formal, ritual life of the community, right? And so the easiest example of that is the weekly Friday prayer, right? But the chaplain doesn't have to give the Friday prayer every week. Maybe they never have to give the Friday prayer. Maybe there's something about the Muslim chaplain that doesn't even qualify them to give the Friday prayers on a regular basis. But what they should be involved in is creating the culture and creating the apparatus by which really meaningful sermons are delivered to the community. And so if you remember, the many times we asked you to give a sermon, oftentimes we would sit down and talk, about what's happening in the community, getting a pulse of what the students are experiencing, maybe what's happening on the socio-political scene, right? So to kind of be involved in a conversation about how best to organize the ritual life of the Muslim community. And then of course you have, in Ramadan, a lot of activities, Eid, if somebody gets married, if somebody were to pass away, all of these things. But doing it from the perspective of what is at the heart of chaplaincy, which is this idea of compassionate care, right? Rahma. If someone were to say, what is the heart of Islamic chaplaincy, it's rahma. And one can argue that this is at the heart of the Islamic ethos altogether. But really, chaplaincy is about trying to bring that rahma, trying to bring that compassion and that mercy of God that is spoken of so beautifully in the Quran and in the Islamic tradition and Islamic spirituality to the lives of the people. And so included in that is also, counseling, right? And so a lot of what the chaplain does is one-on-one sitting down with community members, students, depending on who, which demographic you're serving, and just having a conversation about life, about joy, about sadness, about how to make meaning of failure, how to make meaning of tragedy, but also how to celebrate, the blessings of God in the most appropriate way, right? How to think about deep philosophical questions, but not just through the mind, but also through the qalb, also through the heart, right? So there's this idea that chaplaincy is about marrying the mind and the heart together, in this really beautiful way. And part of that is sometimes counseling is not enough. We have to offer teachings to the wider community. So teaching is really important, and putting on classes and organizing educational seminars that allow people to dive deeper into their faith tradition. So many young people, for example, that I meet, their Islamic education began and ended with Sunday school. And when you talk to them about Islamic literacy and Islamic education, they're really turned off by that idea because they think it's just going to be a repeat of Sunday school. And it takes a lot to convince them that no, we might actually have something much deeper to offer here. Maybe something much more meaningful, maybe something much more impactful. And oftentimes that teaching happens most effectively across interfaith communities, because at this stage of their life, young adults, I'm talking about a college campus, are really interested in knowing what their peers think about the similar life issues that they're thinking about. So when you put them in conversation with other faith communities, it allows them to think much deeper about, the meaning of life, the idea of the hereafter, the idea of, there being the notion of one God or multiple gods. Like these are all like really vibrant conversations that other faith communities are having. So oftentimes that teaching will look like an interfaith activity, as well. So working with other chaplains to create a vibrant, religious life on wherever you are as part of chaplaincy as well.
So people might not know, but of course, Jewish students and Catholic students, they have a very robust chaplaincy support system on campus and off campus, whether it's through the Newman Center for the Catholic students or Hillel Centers for the Jewish students. So it goes without saying that, of course, without knowing the details, I know that you would be, underfunded, undergunned, when you're at these interfaith things. So could you speak a little bit to that? Because I want people to really understand what that's like. I mean, these are institutions that are decades and decades old. So when you're
That's right.
talking about interfaith work, it's all of that, and then it's you. You coming to the table and having to like bear all of this responsibility.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Well, I think it's really important to understand that if you look at any previous uh, minority faith community in this country that struggled, right, and that really went through what we would nowadays call anti Muslim bias or Islamophobia in their own versions, like anti Semitism, you know, or anti Catholic sentiments. One of the things that they picked up on early was the importance of establishing, their own really vibrant institutions on college campuses, because they knew that the college campuses are the places where the thought leaders will emerge from, right? And they knew that, if someone were to go to college and say, my roommate was this brilliant Jewish guy who was a mathematician and a devout Jew, and there's no way what you're saying about Jews is true, because I've had these personal encounters and personal experiences at Harvard and Princeton and Columbia and Rutgers, with these Jewish students, then that would change the landscape of how thought leaders emerging out of these college campuses would form policies around, the freedom of religion and the dignity of faith communities in America. And there was also this idea that the students themselves who are going to these college campuses, if they were not supported in their faith endeavors, and they were all given over to, a secular idea, philosophy of education without any input of their religious rabbis and their priests and their nuns, then they would end up coming out of the college experience totally lost, about their faith,
Mm.
right? So all of these things are things that these communities identified, and for this reason, you have, as you were saying, the halal centers and the Newman centers all across America, functioning really vibrantly, and the national organizations pouring money into these organizations, because they understood that the future of Jews in America and the future of Catholics in America, as two examples of communities who went before us, depended very much on how successfully they built, these communities on college campuses. So now, I think the Muslims have an opportunity to learn from all of this, right? And you're absolutely right about the fact that we have yet to kind of catch up, So, at Princeton, alhamdulillah, all blessings are due to God. Over the years, we've been able to, set up much more of a strong funding structure where we're able to do more and more programming, and now we have a part-time assistant and things like that, but we're way behind the curve, and
Mm.
part of it is because the larger Muslim community has not quite caught up to understand the importance of investing in the Muslim college scene. But it's very ironic because if you think about it, so many of the masajids, right, in America emerge out of the MSA scene, right?
Mm.
It's like a group of young Muslims who established the Muslim Student Association and eventually outgrow it, right? And then say, well, we can't be hanging out on a college campus for the rest of our lives. Why don't we go build a mosque, 10 miles down the road, right?
Mm.
But then what that meant was a lot of the funding from the professional class going away from the college campus communities and going to these mosques. So I think that mosques, in particular, have a special responsibility to recognize their birth mother, which are usually the MSAs that were born much earlier than them down the road. And so there's a lot to be said about that.
Now, in Princeton specifically, I know there's another dynamic that it might not necessarily be shared at other universities, which is one of the things that we're known for at Princeton is we have a very vibrant, whether you call it Near Eastern studies, Oriental studies, Islamic studies, department, one of the oldest in the nation. And for better or for worse, it produces a lot of scholars. And I would say over the last maybe 10, 15 years, a lot of Muslim graduate students like myself would come into these programs. And you would think that a lot of these people would be allies, for the kind of work that you're doing. But from my perspective, at least when I was there, the opposite seemed to be the case, that they might be almost like anti, what you're doing. Either they don't consider you serious enough because, they're like the ivory tower scholar, or believe it or not, a lot of these people are actually secular. Yeah, they're interested in the academic study of Islam, but they're really secular in their practice. I mean, without having to get into names and detail, this is not the point.
Yeah.
But it is a dynamic that I definitely do not envy that you had to navigate. And I would like to learn from you. How did you and how do you continually deal with that element, whether they be from professors or from students?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of is what it is. And when I came to Princeton, I didn't have any misnomers about it. Even though I knew that Princeton University has one of the most historic Near Eastern Studies departments, I didn't expect it to be a natural ally to most of the work that I wanted to do, because I knew that the approach of the Near Eastern Studies department is about dehistoricizing basically the Islamic tradition, which is what academics do. This is what intellectuals do. And that's not my mission, right? My mission is not to go into the Muslim community and to be like, all right, let's dehistoricize this entire thing. Everything you were ever taught about Islam, like question it. But my mission was quite different, which is that let's build upon the strengths of the foundations of faith that you have, right? And what does it mean to be a faithful Muslim in the 21st century? What does it mean to interpret these really rich texts like the Quran and the Hadith in the modern context, right? Um, if you find something objectionable, one approach could be the academic intellectual approach of just dehistoricizing and delegitimizing. But there could be other approaches as well. And what are those approaches? And trying to introduce those approaches which are often missing from the academic discourse. You know, um, and so every now and then I would land upon a student, a graduate student who had that sort of approach, and I was able to draw them into the program and have them teach alongside, like yourself and others. Um, but for the most part, this was not my expectation going into my encounter
Mm.
with either professors, definitely not professors, and definitely not, and usually not students, because I understood that there's a particular crop, of people, and a particular culture that
Mm.
has been formed over the course of not just years but centuries, and my job was not going to go in there and be like the David versus Goliath,
Yeah, yeah.
um, but it was to really just accept that the way I see myself is an inheritor of the prophets, an inheritor of the scholars, an inheritor of the righteous, who throughout the course of human civilization have always been asking the same question, which is that how best in our age can we submit to the best of God's teachings,
Mm.
and how can we cultivate not only expansive minds but also these expansive hearts, you know, that are able to um, critique the socio-economic political poisons of our time and emerge with better answers that come out of these rich religious traditions, but are not exclusive to them either. You know,
Mm.
and so I always saw that to be my project, and I to this day I always push students. I say don't just accept everything you learn. Critique it. And marry your religious discourse into it. You know, and this is why Islamic education and Islamic knowledge is so important, because if you don't know what your religion has to say about all of these different issues, you're just going to walk away thinking that the secular West has, an advance on everything,
Yeah.
without knowing that the traditionalists and the ancients, and those who people have nowadays dismissed as being, of the past, had a lot of things right, you know, and could teach us a lot about, about the world that we're living in.
So, what are the, like, if you had to summarize like two or three top themes that you've noticed with Muslim students that are coming into the university based on your work? I have a hunch of what they might be, but what are you seeing? I mean, other than the interfaith and the establishing the liturgical functions, you're actually dealing with students, and I'm sure students have problems. They confide in you. They have issues. Princeton is not an easy place to be academically. It's very, very tough. It attracts a certain type of person. But what are you seeing? And I think I want people to listen to this, whether they be students or parents. I want people to listen to these type of challenges. If you had to like summarize the top three, what would you say they are?
Yeah, I would say so. One is, philosophical, right? When you go to Princeton University and you take a class, whether in the social sciences or in the material sciences, you're often going to be challenged in your faith, right?
Hmm.
Like I remember there was a student who came to me, and his first day of class, in evolutionary biology, the professor said, if you're a believer, this class is not for you, right?
Welcome.
Yeah, welcome, marhaban. So what do you do with that, right?
Yeah.
Now this student, if he's a person of serious faith and he's a serious scientist, we're going to have to sit down and seriously think this statement through,
Yeah.
right? Because either he emerges out of this class, according to his professor, as a serious scientist or as a serious, faithful person, but he can't be both.
Yeah.
And so that's just an example. But it happens in the social sciences as well. Like there's students who will come to me and they will say, today the professor talked about how the entire notion of the Prophet Muhammad is an entire myth, right? Like that he didn't even exist. Like that this is like all, made up in the books of history.
Mm, mm.
And they're like, and they're confused by this. They're like, we've never heard of an argument like this.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, sitting down with people and really offering them alternative, intellectual approaches, is, I think at the heart of like education chaplaincy,
Mm,
right? And this is where, the graduate students that you were talking about earlier, who do, many of them do, even if they're not completely like, you know, sold by, the tradition or whatever you want to call it, which, is totally fair. I mean, I think, everyone has that right to have a lot of skepticism about, the tradition as well. But still, there's a lot of students who are also not totally sold by, these sort of uh, baloney, secular arguments as well, that you can be, true scientist, or that you can be, or that you have to believe that the Prophet Muhammad is a myth or something like that.
mm,
And so those people can really come and help, kind of, allow these students to process what they're thinking, you
mm.
know. And I, as the chaplain, had a lot of I had to do a lot of growth in this area. I had to do a lot of research myself. I had to do a
Mm.
lot of, study myself, because these are not arguments that, I grew up with either, right? These are things that I learned over
Yeah.
the course of time as well.
Actually, just to pause for a second, you reminded me when I developed this platform, Making Sense of Islam. The first course I put on the platform is a course called The Muslim Mind. Exactly for that reason. So
Right.
offline, when we're done with this conversation, I'd like to send you some information. I'll just WhatsApp it to you. That might come in handy. Because what you just said is the same problem I find in my home community when I'm dealing with younger people, particularly. They haven't gone off to college, or some have, and they're coming back to visit on the holidays. It's, this thread of atheism or materialism or modernism, and unable to reconcile the world around them, the world that they're living in, with their faith. So you just reminded me of that. So I'm going to share that with
Yeah.
you. But what are, do you have like another one or two themes that you have?
Yeah, the other themes I would say are more, socio-cultural gaps that exist between, that often exist between students and their parents, right?
Okay. Hmm.
Oftentimes there'll be kind of like a generational misunderstanding, and it's not dealt with in the healthiest of ways. Oftentimes, the conversation looks more like, if you don't do what we say, we're going to cut off your funding, to go to
Hmm.
college,
Hmm.
rather than like, let's sit down and let me really hear you out as to why you don't want to become a doctor, you know.
Yeah. Like you come to
Or
Princeton and all of a sudden you want to start like study poetry, and your parents are
yeah,
like,
exactly. Like we're
we're not
sending
paying for that.
yeah, exactly. We're not paying for you to study sociology or poetry or
Yeah.
English literature or something like that. Similarly, I think that there's this notion of emerging adulthood, right?
Mm.
That when you go off to college, you're expected to become more and more independent, right? And so, what does it mean to make your own decisions about who you want to marry, and
Mm.
what going back to religion, what philosophical thread within Islam you want to follow? There's like people who suddenly like become like a Maliki, or having grown up in a Hanafi home, they like go back home and they're like praying with their hands down, and like their parents are like, what the heck happened to you?
Yeah. Yeah.
We send you away for a semester and you're like a totally new person. um so helping students navigate really difficult conversations with their parents as they are
Mm.
changing, you know, and trying to, help them figure out how to have healthy conversations as opposed to like these, non-negotiable conversations, you know.
When I was there the first year before you came, one of the things that struck me is uh, the great number of Shia students at Princeton. So, coming from an MSA background, there were always Shias, but they were always a minority. But when I was at Princeton, I would say it was almost like 50-50. Has that still remained the case where there's almost an even number of Sunni and Shia students, or that was just sort of my year that I was there, the
You
years that
know,
I...
it kind of ebbs and flows. It ebbs and flows, but undoubtedly, Princeton is a place where that has witnessed a lot of Shia students, a lot of Shia graduates, and we're a really really diverse community,
Very,
uh,
yeah, very.
very diverse. And I saw that the conversation between Sunnis and Shias was actually quite extraordinary. You know,
Yeah.
uh, people were really into it. People were really into it, and to this day they're still really into it.
So it's not a source of problem, it's like a source of strength for the
It's
community.
a source of strength. Yeah,
Okay,
mashallah,
good.
we've made it into a
Alhamdulillah.
source of strength.
Alhamdulillah.
We've really made it a point to use it as an opportunity for education and conversation.
Now, I know from our private conversations over the years that you have been challenged many, many times with, I'll just use the word ridiculous, predicaments. We don't have to get into the details, whether it be from, the admin, the administration, and, the trustee level, whether it be from like a weird element in the community or whatever. And every time you've shared those with me, I got upset for you. But, mashallah, you're infinitely more diplomatic than me. And, every year I look online and, you guys have this Mawlid program, which, astaghfirullah, we all like envy now. Like, I want to be part of this Mawlid program where when I was there, we had iftar in like a little room, like in the basement of like some building. So I say all of this because it seems to me that one of your skill sets is this diplomacy and the ability to manage through these controversies. I think one of the skills or one of the things is you reach out. I know you've reached out to me, you've reached out to other people. If you want, like what does the Sharia actually say about, 1, 2, 3? And so I think that your counsel, you're reaching out for counsel, but what are the other skill sets that you do? Because, man, that's some tough stuff you've been in.
Yeah.
Some really difficult, predicaments. How do you navigate, not just navigate for your own self, but continue to build, to keep your eye on your own mission?
Right, right. No, it's a very good question. And I think I credit a lot of it to the education around community organizing that I got from the best of teachers, who kind of taught me about this idea of Muslim pluralism in a way that's a bit different from the way that we often see it in a lot of our communities, which is that we recognize there's this challenge, we recognize that there's this problem, which is that Muslims are really really diverse in their orientations, right?
Mm.
So for example, there's the very pro Mawlid Muslims, right? Like, every week they want to do a Mawlid and all they want to do is a Mawlid.
Yeah.
And for them, that's like the heart of Islam is like doing a Mawlid, right? And then there's like those who think that Mawlid is like a total innovation that you shouldn't even like, step foot into it, right?
Mm.
And so because of, this is just one example, because of this kind of difference that you have within the community, there's either a minimalist approach that you can take toward pluralism or a maximalist approach that you can take, right?
Mm. Mm.
And the minimalist approach is that in order to um, hurt the least amount of people's feelings, let's just do the bare minimum that we agree upon.
Mm.
You know? And if we step foot outside of that, we're entering into dangerous territory, right?
Mm.
And if we enter into dangerous territory, we're setting ourselves up for a clash of ideologies and things like that.
Mm.
But there's another approach. The other approach is to say, listen, throughout the course of Islamic history, these different traditions, these different celebrations, these different rituals have developed, and they've given meaning to different segments of the Muslim community.
Mm.
And they've given comfort, and they've given purpose. And regardless of what we do, they're not going to go away, right? Whether we agree with them or we don't agree with them on an individual basis, they're not going to go away because they're too embedded in the story of what it means to be a Muslim,
Mm.
right? And so why not just recognize that not everyone has to come to everything, you know? And why not just recognize that everything that has developed as part of the Muslim story in the course of history has something meaningful to offer? Otherwise, it wouldn't have lasted this long for centuries.
True.
You
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
And so, therefore, we try to look at just about everything that Muslims do, historically in the quote unquote Muslim world, that gives meaning and that gives purpose and that gives enrichment to the spiritual and ethical life. And we say, let's do it here too, because there'll be some Muslims who are going to get some benefit out of it, you know. And maybe there'll be some Muslims who are totally opposed to it, who will be surprised to learn that they actually find this to be pretty interesting as well, you know.
Mm.
And then there might be other Muslims who never heard of any such thing and they just want to try it out and see what it's like, and that's part of the educational experience. And then there might be other Muslims who are totally opposed to it and they come to something like this and they're even more opposed to it.
Yeah.
It's all good, you know. It's all khair, you know. It's all good. But what we do is we create a place for conversations that are not happening in the department of of vagueness, you know, like
Yeah.
theoretical conversations.
Yeah.
We're,
Yeah.
we're we're putting on something practical. We're doing something. You experience it, and you have a conversation based on the experience. You know, people say, oh, I'm against Mawlid because at the Mawlid they put this chair, for the Prophet, and they say the Prophet's going to sit on this chair, and we're waiting for the Prophet to come sit. I say, okay, well, did we do that? We put on a Mawlid. Did we have a grand big chair, sofa, waiting for the Prophet to come and sit? We didn't do that. So is that an essential part of Mawlid, or that's just something that happened that you saw that you're opposed to? Maybe
No,
there's
I mean, the ones that I attended, fortunately with my family, they were highly, I think the year I came, it was Sayyid Hussein Nasr, was my old
Yep.
professor, someone we both respect highly. It was very educational and
Yeah.
highly intellectual and spiritual at the same time. And if I remember correctly, there were a lot of non-Muslims that were in attendance. It was sort of like, let's go to the Muslim cultural event that they're having, and for
Exactly.
us. So I think you've done a great job. And that's a wonderful answer, because sometimes, and I've said this before in other conversations on the podcast, but sometimes it's very easy for somebody like me to become tribal. Hey, look, this person's not in my tribe, they don't belong in my tent. And it's very, very easy to do that. It's so easy just to slip into that. And then you lose the whole prophetic model, because that's not what the
Right.
Prophet, that's obviously not what he was sent to do. He was sent, to bring us all together. So it's a good reminder. I'm glad you phrased it that way. It's so easy. And I think it's the coward's way and the easy way to just become tribal and be like, oh, that person's not with me. So, kudos to you and for what you've done, mashallah, to the community. So just to bridge to another sort of minor topic before we get to a bigger topic, I do want to go back in time and ask you about the Qur'an for Dummies book. So if people don't know you as the chaplain at Princeton, I'm sure they'll definitely know you for that book. And I sort of wanted to understand from you the genesis behind that project and how it came about and how you did it and accomplished it, and your thoughts that some of the only books that future ISIS fighters took with them on their journey to fight was the Quran for Dummies book.
Subhanallah. I never thought I would hear that in my life,
Neither did I.
So the genesis of it is actually kind of interesting because, when I was in college, I was someone who was committed to the profession of journalism.
Mm.
And the way that I saw my life panning out before 9/11 happened was that I saw myself traveling throughout the country, traveling throughout the world, and telling the stories of the voiceless. Like that was kind of like my notion of a purposeful life. I always
Anybody
loved,
that's voiceless, just the disenfranchised.
yeah, disenfranchised, victims of war, victims of poverty,
Okay.
people who just aren't given a voice usually. And I picked up the art of storytelling
Mm.
and the joy of storytelling at a young age. I really enjoyed writing. I really enjoyed telling the stories of people. And so this is something that I was really drawn to. And I went to Indiana University, where they have a very famous school called Ernie Pyle School of Journalism.
Mm.
And that was one of the main reasons I went there, was because I wanted to be trained there. And I had some excellent teachers, who taught me to write well and so on. And so that was kind of my notion of what a good life would a purposeful life would look like after college. And I did everything in college to set myself up with the right internships and things like that to go into this profession in that manner. And then lo and behold, my senior year of college, 9/11 happens, right?
Mm.
And I'm one of the leaders within the MSA. And that entire senior year of college is a total blur, um, because very little of it is, going to classes or doing anything that a senior in college would do.
That's an understatement. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. You remember what that period was like, and so every day we're being invited to speak at libraries and churches and synagogues and at government halls, even as like 21, 22, 23 year olds, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And we're being expected to draft statements to the media, and to put on interfaith healing events, and totally things that are beyond the pale of what
No one
a
prepared us for these
yeah,
things.
nobody prepared
No
us.
one told us how
Nobody
to do
prepared.
them.
Yeah, exactly. And it's quite an amazing story, actually, to think about how such young people in their early 20s were able to take on such tasks. And many
Mm.
of us, I think, found our calling out of that as well. I think that that's certainly true for me. And that experience really stuck with me because I started to really think deeply about how there was this big problem, this big gap in the Muslim community, of where there weren't enough Muslim American born and raised, religious leaders and thinkers who were not only speaking to the hearts and minds of young Muslims in this country, but also speaking in the language and in the culture of the people who live as our neighbors and as our co-workers and as our classmates in America. And so I started thinking more and more deeply about that as I started visiting more and more of these churches and synagogues and libraries, and people
Mm.
asking me some very profound and some very basic questions about Islam, and realizing that we hadn't quite done our task, beyond the African American community, of course.
Yeah. Mm.
African American community is par excellence in this, of having reached out way before it was cool to reach out, and doing all these interfaith activities before that was even seen as
Sure.
something legitimate to do, and all of these things. But the rest of the community was way behind. And even my introduction to chaplaincy, I have to give a lot of credit to the African American community, because the main form of religious leadership in the public square that Muslims really brought, was through chaplaincy, mostly through the African American Muslim community. You know, Otherwise, Muslim religious leadership has largely been more private, more mosque and
Sure.
Muslim driven. You know, and so that question really, turned a lot in my heart. And as I went out in the world, moving to Chicago and trying my hand at, a career in journalism and things like that, realizing this stuff is really hard to get into the media and things of that nature, I was drawn more and more to the work of, religious education, religious activism, religious community organizing, and reaching out to people of other faiths. And somewhere along the line, the Wiley publishers, which are based in Indiana, out of all the places,
Oh, I didn't realize that. Okay.
Indianapolis, Indiana,
Hmm.
they were like, we need to have a book out there that explains to non-Muslims what the Quran is all about. And they have the famous series, the Dummies series.
Yeah.
And the Dummies series is everything, how to raise your dog for dummies and how to, everything for dummies, right? So they said, why don't we have a book called, the Quran for Dummies?
Hmm.
They found it really hard to find, and this goes to what we were just talking about. They found it really hard to find an author.
Sure.
There were very few Muslims who were like willing to sign themselves up because there's this lack of confidence. How do we speak to, people beyond our own community?
Yeah.
You know, and it's like a crisis of confidence almost. So when this project somehow landed at my feet through a combination of it first going to a professor that I used to work very closely with at Indiana University, and then so on and so forth. When the project kind of landed at my feet, I was also full of skepticism. But look, my teachers, my parents, many other people, they were like, if you don't take on this project, who knows whose hands it's going to get into.
Sure.
Maybe Steve Emerson or someone else,
Hmm.
will
Yeah.
will end up writing this book. So if it's landed in your hands, you've got to make something out of this. And I said, fair enough. And so I took that almost entire year to really, do my research and to, sit down and talk to a lot of, scholars and thinkers and teachers and do a lot of reading, a lot of listening, and tried to put this book together. And by no means will I say that it's, the best book or anything like that, but I think it was a good effort, especially for that time. There were very, very few books in the public square that exposed people to mainstream Muslim thought, about the Quran. So I am proud of that achievement.
Alhamdulillah. Do you still like give it out?
Not really. I don't think I ever, drew that much in confidence about the book. I think it goes to the problem of the crisis of confidence. But, I don't think I ever was, that exceptionally proud of the work to like be handing it out. It was more like, people just kept buying it. And to this day, they email me and they say, I've read your book and I have some questions. And, like almost on a weekly basis, I entertain questions from people who are reading the book.
Interesting.
So I've never
Interesting.
really had to do like self-promotion.
So I want to respect your time. So I want to sort of, as we round the next curve, towards the end, something a little bit more personal. One of my daily routines is that I pray a janazah, absent janazah prayer every night.
Mm.
On anyone who's died, any Muslim who's died, no one prayed over them. And then the last, takbir, for a moment, I visualize my own death, my own mortality. And for me, that's been a practice, alhamdulillah, for almost a decade now. And it's been very transformative for me for two reasons. Number one, nothing wakes you up like the fact that you're remembering that you're going to die. And it kind of shakes off all of the excess non-essential stuff. Helps you focus. And number two, it's a great form of stress release for me. I do a lot of stressful work, or I tend to get stressed out for my work. So when I do that before I sleep, typically, I kind of like, okay, well, I mean, this might be it, right? I might sleep and not wake up. So I don't want to go to sleep worried about this email or that phone call. And then recently, I even made a video about it, but I started wearing this ring. This is the ring that Sayyidina Umar used to wear. And it says, "Kafa bil mauti wa'idha," that death is enough of a reminder.
Mm.
So the remembrance of death has been a very important part of my life. And I know that a little over a year ago, you were diagnosed with cancer. We were heartbroken. I read that article that you wrote on Medium. I tried to reach out to you, but I realized, everyone was probably, so I did want to, I wanted to give you your space. So, I mean, it is personal. I guess I kind of queued it up. So I mean, we're just in the personal space now, but I really would love to hear from you what that meant. I mean, you put it so beautifully in the article. It's hard for me to restate it. What that means for you. Having to live with this diagnosis. Inshallah, we pray for your health and your
Ameen.
recovery and everything. But it's been a roller coaster for you health-wise. I know for the last year specifically, and your family and your community. What has that been like? And help bring that to us and to the people that are watching and listening, because I think we all need this reminder.
Yeah. Well, thank you for bringing it up. It is, at once both personal and yet very communal. What I'm going through, because my role in the community is to be there for people, and to be this shepherd. And now, as far as we can tell, the prognosis is that the shepherd is looking to the end of his life. You know, and I don't say this out of any sort of skepticism in God's mercy or in God's miracles, but I actually say this out of the fact that we as Muslims grow up in an existential philosophist tradition, which is this idea that we take death to be inevitable, and we take death to not only be something that is inevitable, but we also take it to be something that's deeply meaningful and purposeful, right? And that life itself cannot have meaning without an understanding that we're only here for a few temporary years,
Hmm.
and that we're just here to plant a few seeds that hopefully we get to see their full fruition in a totally other afterlife. We're not actually working for this hayatud dunya. We're not actually working entirely for this world.
Hmm.
We understand that God has brought us into this world and has given us existence, and we're grateful for that. We understand that our purpose is to worship God. We understand that our role is to cultivate the earth, for the sake of God, to infuse the earth with the attributes and the names of God, including our own hearts and our own character. But ultimately, we don't see the life of this world as being the place where we see our perfected mission.
Hmm.
you know our perfected mission is something that we see for the hereafter. you know and I think that that's a really important reminder, like the way you were describing, in the sense that it relieves you of stress, but it also reminds you that you know that that if if you're expecting for all of your life's works to be shown before your eyes here in this world, you're always going to be very disappointed and disgruntled, you know,
Hmm.
because a lot of the things you work for in this world, you're not going to see it with your own eyes. And in reality, there's this idea that you're only doing your little bit, in this project of human civilization to move the ship forward, you know and then you're going to be given a totally different vantage point that transcends the earthly realm, in which you see things from the perspective of the angels, and you see things from the perspective of the unseen, that totally boggles your mind. And you even start to realize, like, some of the limitations of the work that you were doing in this world, like the story of Moses and Khidr in the Quran,
Hmm.
where, like, Moses is so confident about his legal rulings,
Yeah.
until he's told about the reality behind the reality,
Yeah. Yeah.
you know? Um, and so, death is actually an opportunity for us to transcend this very temporal and very short visioned uh, earthly life, and to be able to see things about the world from a totally different perspective. And in that way, death is it's a gift for the believer, you know,
Yeah.
to be able to see things, from a much wider perspective. And I think that as we're living and as we're doing our work, it's important for us to know that even though we don't always know what's going on from the perspective of the other dimension, to know that there are these other dimensions at work. So to not become overly joyous when things happen in accordance with our wishes, and to not become overly depressed when things don't happen in accordance with our wishes, you know.
So hey, as you're speaking, I mean, it's so hard on me to hear you say that, but I'm so happy of your attitude. You remind me of that hadith, the hadith of the fasila that the Prophet ﷺ, he said, if the hour is upon you and there's a seed in your hand, plant the seed.
That's right.
And it sounds to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds to me that your reaction to this diagnosis, prognosis, is, well, okay, well, I'm just going to continue doing what I'm doing. Is that
That's it.
correct? Is that
That's it.
sort of
That's it.
so? Man, I think a lot of us want to be there. In other words, we want to be what is it that makes you so confident in what you're doing that even something as massive as your own mortality that you're facing doesn't faze you from continuing what you're doing?
Yeah.
Can you just articulate that for us? What's your feeling on the inside? And like, no, this, well, doesn't make a difference because I'm just going to continue doing what I'm doing.
Yeah, I'm so grateful. I say this often. I'm so grateful that in Islam, I believe that we're given a teacher in the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, who teaches us not only how to live, but also how to die. And what I mean by that is that in the final moments and hours of the Prophet's life, he had total contentment. He had total rida, you know, even though he was sent for an extraordinary mission. If there's someone who we cannot live without, it's a prophet, right? Like you and I are like nobodies, right? Compared to the prophets. So when people say, no, you can't go, well, if the prophets went, then who am I not to go, right? So if there's somebody who we still need around, it's the prophet.
Hmm.
But the prophet also had a time, at a relatively young age in his mid 60s, right? And he left. That was it. And when the angel said, your Lord gives you a choice, do you want to stay or do you want to go back to your Lord? He said, I want to go back to my God. I want to go back to Allah. That was his DNR,
Yeah.
necessitate, right? Because he understood that, you have to have contentment with the time that God has given you in this life. And, it's not going to be extended for even a moment beyond what God's decree is. So you
Hmm.
might as well just make full use of it, and be someone who is committed to spending every single day of that life that God has decreed in doing something that is good, in doing something that is a breath of fresh air, that is doing something like planting a seed in the earth. Um, because it's all going to come to an end at some point, anyways. So being content with that, being at peace with that,
Yeah.
is what the Prophet, peace be upon him, really taught me and my family. I see this in my family. I don't see my family as being people who are very scared of death. We're like a very, we're content about this idea. You know, Even though, mashallah, God has given my parents a long life. We're not people who are. We're not a family. We're not a people who are scared of death. Like we accept this reality. You know, um, and so I think the way to get there is just to accept that this is how Allah has made the world. This is how Allah has made the universe, and there's a very real purpose in it. Because if we were to live forever, we would act very very tyrannically. You know,
Hmm.
and in the Quran, this is one of the temptations that Satan tries to give to Adam and Eve when he tempts them from the heavenly state.
Yeah.
He says, oh, your Lord only doesn't want you to eat from this tree so that you don't become immortals. You know, there's something very tempting. There's something very, very tempting about wanting to have immortality, you know. And in fact, I find I'm often surprised at how uncomfortable religious people are with the notion of death. Like ever since my diagnosis and my prognosis, like people have been coming from everywhere out of the woodworks to be like, if you just read this one dua, if you just read this one surah, and you read it like this, and you blow it in the nose and you blow it in the ears and all these things, you won't die. But I'm like, but doesn't the Quran say kullu nafsin dha'iqatul maut? Like every soul is going to die. Like what does it mean, right?
Mm, mm.
Like what does it mean that you're not going to like? And so I think that Muslims themselves are often very confused about like what is being, what is decreed here, because God has promised in the Quran that every single soul is going to be touched by death. Like you're not going to.
That's sort of where I wanted to make this a practice for myself daily, because I realized we talk about it, rationally, but we don't experience it. And it's been a tremendous, it helps put everything in my life in focus. The moment that I'm able to remember that, look, this is it. You realize how much of the day, how many hours, minutes we waste on things that are just not essential, or how many times we get upset. Who cares? I mean, it's gone. Whatever that the person cut you off or the person was rude to you, it's over. It's gone. And you don't want to go to sleep. I don't want to go to sleep with that feeling. I don't want to hold on to it. I just want to sort of like release. So yeah, man, alhamdulillah. I mean, I'm so grateful for our friendship. I'm so grateful, that you're a friend. And, when I came to Princeton, I had no idea that you were going to show up at all.
MashaAllah.
So, I mean, I was, completely, utterly surprised and so happy. I only wish I could have stayed longer, but I think my wife would have killed me if we prolonged what was already a very long journey. And, your friendship has meant a lot to me. And all the times we've interacted, they've meant a lot to me. And I'm one of the people that you have touched, and me and my family, and we're in your debt for what you did what you did and continue to do at Princeton to revitalize that community. So thank you, Jazakallah kulla khair for all of that, and for spending this time with me this afternoon. Usually I like to ask guests to leave us with a thought, but what I was thinking is what I would like from you is, what would your ask be of me? Somebody that was and is sort of kind of connected to the Princeton community. How can we help you and continue the work that you're doing?
Yeah, no, thank you. Well, thank you for having me. This was a really fun hour to spend with you, and I'm really grateful for our friendship as well, and for everything that you and your family have given to Princeton Muslim life. And I would ask that you, as an alum, see this as your as one of your communities, you know, and that you stay involved, and that you make it a point to make sure that whoever comes after me is someone that you introduce yourself to, and ask, how can I be helpful? And that it's that this be a community that you don't just say, I went there, I saw things, I benefited, but rather you say that I went there, I saw things, I benefited, and I want to now give back, you know. And whether that's opening up some of my classes to students, uh, you know, um, or creating opportunities for conversation, all these extraordinary talents that you, Tariq, bring to the community, would be really, would be really important. Even during my lifetime, I say this, that, we should work on that,
Inshallah. Well, that's a very big to-do list that I'm gladly accept and will look forward to executing. And right when we finish, I will send you some information about the stuff I told you about. And let's keep the conversation going. Pray for your health and a long, full life, inshallah. I hope that this is not the first time we have a recorded conversation. Pray for yourself and your family, inshallah. But thank you, Sohaib, so much for spending this time. I really do appreciate. I know you're busy.
Thank you.
And I do really appreciate you taking the time out to have this conversation.
Alhamdulillah. Be well. and give my salam to your family.
Inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum